that's fine. Fine. Laura found out that I'm Jewish, from a Jewish family, and she thought it would be interesting for me to share some of these things with you. I don't have a whole lot to say because my family was a little bit different, but I'll start by giving you an idea of Judaism, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Let's take Christianity. We're all Christians here. Okay, under the umbrella of Christianity, we have Roman Catholics and Baptists and Methodists and Episcopalians and Lutherans and the whole bit, but we're all Christian. Each one different traditions, different philosophies, different interpretations, but we all have the same core of faith and trust in Jesus Christ. Okay, well, Judaism is kind of the same thing. As a religion, it goes way back to Genesis with Abraham. In fact, so does Islam and Christianity. When God told Abraham his seed would scatter, his descendants would be all over, and I took a class from UNI. We had a Muslim scholar there, a Jewish scholar, and a Christian scholar whom I happen to know. And we had a handout, and she talked about the Abrahamic religions. That is, these are the three monotheistic or believing in one God religions that we all, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, trace back to Genesis, to Father Abraham. So in many ways, we're all more connected than we might think. And in the last few years, I've been giving more thought to Christianity and how little we seem to acknowledge the Jewishness of Jesus. It's like it's sort of passed over. So Laura thought it would be interesting for me to talk about that. Well, within Judaism, just like within Christianity, you have several groups and several interpretations of the laws. And if you're interested, which you're probably not interested in going through Deuteronomy and Leviticus and all that, you'll find a lot of the laws that are strict, that are observed, many of them by very religious and observant Jews today. So I grew up in a Jewish home. My mother and father were Jewish, and all my family was Jewish. My father came over to this country from Odessa, Russia, as a 2-year-old. Keith, my son, Winnie and I go back a long ways. That's why I said, what is your last name? It's nice to see a familiar face. My son Keith was in New York and went to Ellis Island and found on the USS Potsdam that docked at Ellis Island in 1906 the name of my father, David Gelfand, 2 years old. So that was my dad. My mother was born in New York. So the family, all that I know, and I don't have a big family, all consider themselves Jewish. Well, as in Christianity, you have a lot of differences in Judaism too. Differences in how people feel about it, how they worship or don't worship, what the customs are, and so forth. Basically, my family were not religious Jews. My grandmother kept a kosher household. She lived with us for many years. And again, the restrictions and the laws for that are found in the Old Testament back to Leviticus and Deuteronomy. For instance, one of the laws is God said you don't mix the calf's milk with its meat or something like that. So my grandmother would cook a roast, but she would not serve any dairy with it because that was mixing the two things with milk. She also kept a kosher home. My dad was very patient, and every week he would drive her down. This was in California, in Los Angeles. He would drive her down to the kosher butcher, and they would haggle, haggle over this and haggle over that. And my dad was very patient, and that's the meat that my grandmother was always kosher. She did not, of course, eat bacon or pork, but my family did, and she had no objections to that at all. So my mother cooked bacon, and my dad and I ate that, and all of that sort of thing. So, but nobody in my family were observant Jews in terms of the religion. I remember as a child thinking that Moses was God or something. I didn't know. We didn't discuss it in the family. So later on I knew differently. But anyway, at that point, we observed a lot of the Jewish holidays. There's a big one coming up now, coming up at Easter. Usually there's a holiday that comes up at Easter, which commemorates the Israelites escaping from slavery and all of that kind of thing. Isn't that where Moses was told that he could not see the promised
isn't
land?
that Passover, Mom?
Passover, that's right, yeah. And Laura was telling me that the church is going to have, or had seders. These are the traditional religious dinners. And there are some, and I don't know this for a fact, but there are some who feel that what we call the Last Supper was actually a kind of observance of Seder, of the Passover, because Jesus was Jewish. And so I know that he was born into an Orthodox Jewish family. When he was 8 days old, Mary and Joseph took him to the temple, which was the custom, to be dedicated to God. Well, when my son was 8 days old, my uncle was quite upset that Ralph and I didn't take him to the temple to be dedicated to God. We just wasn't in the family to follow these observances, so we didn't do that. And then he knew Scripture well, Jesus did, as you know. And his burial was that of a typical Jewish person, buried before the Sabbath, which they said, we've got to do this before the Sabbath, in a shroud or a wooden casket or something. So that's the heritage of those of us that are Jewish. According to Jewish tradition, anyone who is born of a Jewish mother, no matter what their religion, is considered a Jew. So if I wanted to go back to Israel and live under the law of return, or Karen, we could go back, even though we are Christians. That's just the way it is. In Judaism, it's carried down through the female line rather than the male line. Yeah. So I grew up without any formal observance of the holiday. Sometimes my mother kept me out of school for the holiday, which was okay because that was allowed to do. But my parents, it wasn't a big thing. I sang Christmas carols, and I went in the Christmas plays, and I had a stocking, and at some point we moved to a house, and we had a little tree. We did these things. When we came, now this is getting away from my childhood, but when we came to Iowa, the kids were little, and Sons of Jacob Synagogue was our only link to Iowa. We didn't know anybody. And some of you maybe remember Mel and Sylvia Finkelstein, who were very active in the synagogue at that time, or the Maidens. And Mel was very helpful to us. He took us around, and Ralph and I joined the synagogue, and I even taught 9th grade Sunday school, but it was just hard for me to, probably my fault. The students weren't that interested, and I probably wasn't that interesting a teacher either. And we tried the Hanukkah thing where we did the Hanukkah gelt, the money and the dreidels, and that was fun. But it just didn't resonate with me, yes.
So when did you become a Christian?
I'm coming to that.
Okay.
No, I'm not going to talk long. I'm building up to that. I did not become a Christian kneeling in a road and Christ said, hey, stop persecuting me. That was Paul, right? Okay. I guess my interest in the religion just started when I was probably a young adult, and I just became interested in it, and I met some people that were Christians, and so we talked and all of that. And when I got to be in my 40s, this was in 1974, I felt very strongly that that was something I wanted to do. I really wanted to be baptized into the Christian faith. And so I almost brought my baptismal certificate to show you, but I didn't. And on March something or other in 1974, Karen and Kathy and I were baptized in the chapel at Nazareth by Homer Larson. And for me as an adult, because I knew exactly what I was doing, I knew exactly what I was saying, I knew what it meant, rather than an infant who has to go through the confirmation and learn all that. To me, at that time, it was a very moving and experience. So that's in a sense, that's kind of how I got to be where I am.
So your husband was also a Christian?
No, my husband was not.
Okay.
He did not, he considered himself Jewish, but only in a cultural family sense. He was not a believer, and he didn't go to synagogue, although we did try doing some Friday night Sabbath services. Those are really nice. you put on a scarf, the woman, and you say the prayer over the candles and all of that kind of thing. And that didn't. But an interesting aside, which I told some people, was in the 60s, Ralph got a Ford Foundation scholarship grant to go to teach in Nairobi, Kenya. So Keith was barely 2, and Karen's older sister was still 3 or 4 months old. We took the kids and trooped to Africa. I'm an only child. And when we said to my mother, by the way, Mom, we're moving to Africa, she said, what? You're taking those babies where? I think she thought we were going to live in a mud hut. Actually, I wasn't sure either, but we went, and we had nice accommodations. But what I wanted to bring out was here in Africa, in Nairobi, which at the time was still considered somewhat primitive. There was, and probably still is, a Jewish synagogue. And from the ladies in that synagogue, I learned how to make matzo ball soup, which I no longer remember how to make. So the holiday of Passover is coming now, and my grandmother, we used to buy matzah. Matzah is unleavened bread because you're not allowed to eat bread and so forth. So that's kind of my story, and it came about because as a Christian, I somehow felt that the role of Jesus as a Jew, that was our heritage too as Christians, because he didn't die a Christian. He died an Orthodox Jewish man. So that's anything that I have to say. Any questions? I may not be able to answer. She gets a bigger allowance for clapping. You know. Well, that's the story of how I got there. So
Edith Schaefer wrote a book called Christianity is Jewish.
Yes, I've had that book. Yeah. And that's true. It is. Right.
Yeah.
So.
Was there somebody special that talked with you that helped you?
Well, I
understand
did.
the
Yeah, I
differences?
did have met different people. The Jacobs family. You probably know them. When Dr. Jacobs, his wife. I knew them.
Very well.
We lived in the Bible camp for a summer with the kids while we were moving from one place to. We didn't have anywhere to stay. We came here with an old Nash Rambler, 3 little kids, about a thing of clothes and $600, and we didn't have anywhere to stay, so that's where we stayed. So I got to talking with her about it, and that is one way certainly that people find out about different faiths and different beliefs and so forth. But I just and I had other friends. As a child growing up, I lived in mixed neighborhoods, went to school. I have no recollection, which was very good. I never had any sort of anti-Semitic remarks. Nobody ever called me a name. Nobody ever wouldn't be with me. The reason I was always picked last in PE was because I wasn't very good at it, not because I was Jewish. You know, the team leaders always know who's the last one to pick, so that was me. But I was fortunate growing up. I grew up with a mixed group of people, different religions. In New York, we had a rabbi, and then there was a Catholic church nearby. And I remember that the rabbi and the priest would get together, and the kids played together. And so I was fortunate in that regard that I never had any sort of thing. But unfortunately, I just heard on the news today, and I don't know if it's true, that there is a rise in this country on anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim. And those things really frighten me, you know. Look what the Jews have gone through all their life. Look what the African Americans went through their lives in this country and overseas, even worse. It's hard. It's just human nature, I guess, that we can't all see each other as children of God and people worthy of being cared about. And there's this, before I stop, I'll tell you something that really impressed me. I went to the United Church of Christ down on University. We had some classes there. And going in the door, there was a sign, and it said, Jesus didn't discriminate, nor do we. And I thought, that's something we should all keep in mind. Because not everybody agrees with what we are, what we think, no matter what we are, whether it's politics or religion or anything else. But we're all human beings, children of God, And we need to think about that a little more, as, not us, of course, but as other groups do. Thank you so much for inviting me today. You're a really nice, friendly group. I appreciate it. Thank you. And I got to go back years ago with Winnie Rohrbaugh. I just knew I knew her somehow.
I kept
So
looking at you
that worked
thinking,
out so well.
Harriet, yes, I think I know her.
Yeah.
How did you know each other?
From, our kids all went to NU High School,
Mhm.
and people like Sandra.
And medical
Space.
associates. I remember Dr. Rohrbaugh. A lot of the kids, a lot of the people I knew went to him for
And then
his treatment.
we had the youth group for 2 years, Phil and I did.
I'm not
Before
surprised.
we had a youth pastor, we were the youth sponsors. And so we knew all of their friends, and that included Kathy,
Mhm,
particularly
mhm,
Kathy.
mhm.
I don't know, you were a little younger maybe at that time.
Yep.
And
You were the youngest?
Yes.
so, yep, I remember that. It was fun, good fun times.